Hello everybody and welcome to lecture 701, and today we are going to continue once more with a short chapter of the fantastic book of Ashish Dalela. We have a beautiful sunny day today. It's the last of November, so it's extraordinary, and it's even snow outside. So we might be dreaming of a white Christmas and even get one. So it sounds fantastic and feels fantastic. So today I would like to take next chapter, chapter 6, and it's called Dawkins' Challenge. Richard Dawkins, in his book The God Delusion, presents a three-step argument for the non-existence of God. First, he claims a universe made by God would be different from the universe created by natural occurrences. Second, he claims that our universe fits better with the idea that is a product of natural occurrences than with the idea of God as its creator. Third, he concludes that since our universe is more compatible with the idea of natural causes than with the idea of God, we are dealing with a naturalistic rather than theistic universe. Dawkins' point is that if God exists, then this must make some observable difference to the nature of reality. If there is no observable difference, then God cannot be rationally confirmed or denied from the facts we can observe in the world. In such a scenario, God's existence is subject to Occam's razor, i.e., not multiplying entities beyond necessity. And can be discarded as superfluous hypothesis. Now we can conclude that God does not exist. I personally think this is a great argument because it forces us to think about the implications the existence of God has in terms of observable facts in the material world. Of course, religious thought claims that God does make a difference in the world, intervening through his grace, performing miracles that violate well-known laws of science. But unless we understand how God intervenes in the world, such effects may also be attributed to material causes. After all, everything that happens in nature is possible naturally. God doesn't create something impossible or create something that could never be created by natural means. So the question is only whether God caused something, or was it caused by natural means? To argue one way or another, one would need to understand how God intervenes in nature, and how he could cause anything, if at all. Richard Dawkins' argument is correct if science of today is indeed the final picture of reality, because this picture of nature defines a notion of causality that would make any causal connection between God and nature impossible. However, I don't think that current science is the final picture of reality. all areas of science, including mathematics, computing, physics, linguistics, and biology, suffer from problems of incompleteness, indeterminism, uncertainty, which make it clear that physical notions of causality are insufficient. The analysis of this problem, which I discussed in my other books, reveals that they can be solved if reality is treated as symbols, representing meaning rather than things. This flaw will remain a permanent limitation of science unless its foundations are revised. If, however, the scientific foundation are revised, thereby inducting a fundamental role for meaning in nature, then this will also change the explanation of the universe's origin. Now we could ask, what is the origin of all meanings? If nature is physical and meanings are emergent properties of physical aggregations, then there is no role for God in the universe. However, if nature is semantic and meanings are fundamental, rather than emergent properties, which in turn produce material objects, then there is a very important role for God in the universe. The role is that God would now be the origin of all meanings. The role is that God would now be the origin of all meanings, would in fact be described as a primordial, or the most abstract meaning from which other contingent or detailed meanings are produced. The existence of God, therefore, makes a difference to the scientific study of nature. The difference is that if God exists, then nature would be described as symbols of meanings, rather than as meaningless things. In Vedic philosophy, God is described as the combination of 6 original meanings: knowledge, beauty, power, fame, wealth, and detachment. To just take one of these for illustration, there are many kinds of knowledge in this world. But we assume something called knowledge itself. How is knowledge different from a specific form of knowledge, e.g. physics? Similarly, there are many kinds of beauties, but what is beauty itself? Apart from its manifestations. Just like modern science postulates physical properties, such as mass and charge. But at some point we must ask, what is mass? What is charge? Similarly, if we study matter in terms of meanings, then we will arrive at the primordial meanings, and we will then ask, what is the original meaning from which diverse meanings manifest? If the problem of science are overcome by the symbolic treatment of matter, then meaning is the primordial reality. Although this meaning exists in diverse forms of this world, such as tables and chairs, properties like color and shape, etc. These meanings form a class hierarchy in which the abstract meaning generate the contingent meaning. If the problems of science are overcome by the symbolic treatment of matter, then meaning is the primordial reality, although this meaning exists in diverse forms of this world, such as tables and chairs, property like color and shape, etc. These meanings form a class hierarchy in which the abstract meaning generates the contingent meaning. To trace the origin of all meaning, we must go to the root of this hierarchy. This root in Vedic philosophy is God. And he is the form of 6 original meanings. The diversity of meanings springs from these 6 meanings, as a seed expands into a tree. The role for God in this approach to the divine is not necessitated by our personal needs to believe in the divine. It is rather impelled by the problems of incompleteness in science, which propel us towards the study of the material world as diverse meanings. Once we have revised our ideology about matter, then the existence of God is indeed a scientific question. As Dawkins asserts, it however requires a fundamental revision to materialism. Matter is no longer physical properties but diverse kinds of meanings. This revision in science must occur before God can be a scientific question. So that goes to say that we have a shift going from materiality to meaning, a little bit like Wittgenstein, I'd say. So far, so good. Let's go pour me some tea here. Sorry. Next paragraph is God's existence and semantic science. If theories of matter are incomplete without incorporating meaning, then the origin of the universe is also incomplete without the origin of meaning. A universe that is compromised only of physical properties clearly has no role for God, but a universe compromised only of such properties is also incomplete, indeterministic and uncertain. The question of the existence of God is therefore tied to the question of whether the uncertainty, indeterminism and incompleteness of science are ontological features of reality or only epistemic problems of the current scientific theories describing this reality. In other words, is nature indeterministic and our theories simply report this indeterminism? Or is it so that nature is causally complete, but our theories are not able to completely capture the nature of that causality? Even if both alternatives are prima facie equally likely from the standpoint of modern science, It is not difficult to see that if nature is causally complete, and we can build theories of nature that are causally complete, then these theories will make more predictions than the causally incomplete theories. A theory that makes more predictions is obviously a better theory than the one that leaves some facts unpredicted, thereby leading to an indeterminism. Furthermore, a theory which depicts nature as being causally complete is better than the one that depicts it as being incomplete. So, the question about the existence of God is therefore indeed a scientific question. But it is also a question that goes to the root of the problems of uncertainty, indeterminism, and incompleteness in science. Science stumbles on these problems because scientific theories describe symbols of meaning as objects without meanings. Meanings cannot be constructed from an aggregation of material objects, although material objects can be constructed from meanings. The science of meaning will therefore include the predictions of current science, but go beyond them. Once the material objects are produced from meanings, we must now ask, from where are the meanings produced? We saw earlier how the creation of meaning can be understood as being produced from an origin of all meanings. All meaning in the material world exists as distinction or oppositions. There are individual observers who choose one side of the distinction. However, the opposition between these conflicting sides is reconciled in a more abstract concept. For example, the conflict between white and black is reconciled in the concept of color. So to understand the diversity yet grasp its origin from a unity, we must rise up the conceptual hierarchy. In this case, this rising involves going beyond the distinction and seeking their origin. There can be choices that choose one side of the distinction, and there must be choices that produce both sides of the distinction. The person observing the lower parts of this hierarchy will see the oppositions and choose one of them, but the person higher in the hierarchy will find greater unity and lesser opposition. At the root of this hierarchy, all conflicts, oppositions, and contradictions will be reconciled. In Vedic philosophy, God's consciousness is different from our consciousness, because the former constitutes the unity underlying the diversity. His consciousness is the root in which all contradictions, oppositions, and distinctions are reconciled. The existence of God thus becomes necessary when nature is symbols rather than objects. A universe without God is a universe without meanings. The existence of God as someone who makes a difference in the universe is therefore a scientific question. Very specifically, this implies that nature is comprised of symbols rather than objects. And if we describe symbols as objects, we are describing them incompletely. This incompleteness pervades current science, and it is thus important to understand its wider implications. While an exhaustive discussion of scientific problems cannot be done in the limited space here, well, it's indeed limited, I will briefly try to describe them through examples. I will take on an example in mathematics and another one in physics. The reader is referred to my other work, Gödel's Mistake and Quantum Meaning, for an in-depth discussion. Let's begin with mathematics. The problem of mathematics is that number can be described in three different ways, as things, concepts, and names. But mathematics cannot deal with these distinctions without incorporating an explicit rule for meanings. Let's illustrate this problem with the following three sentences. Nobody has 6 letters. Nobody is perfect. I'm a nobody. In the first statement, the word nobody is a thing or a sequence of 6 letters. In the second statement, the word nobody is a name that refers to people. In the third statement, nobody represents the concept of insignificance. Now, if you use these words interchangeably, we can create interesting conclusions such as the following. Nobody's perfect, I'm nobody, therefore I'm perfect. Nobody's perfect, nobody has 6 letters, therefore perfect has 6 letters. In the first case, we have arrived at an erroneous conclusion, but it's not logically incorrect. In the second case, we have arrived at a logical contradiction because the word perfect has 7 letters and not 6. It's easy to understand the source of these paradoxes. The problem is that the word nobody can denote things, concepts, and names. To use language correctly, we must respect these categorical distinctions. Erroneous conclusions and logical paradoxes can arise when these distinctions are not honored. Kurt Gödel used this type of reasoning in mathematics to arrive at contradictions. The genesis of the contradiction lies in the fact that mathematics cannot distinguish between names, concepts, and things. If meanings exist in nature, then mathematics cannot describe them without logical paradoxes. This is called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel's incompleteness is relevant to physical theories because in current science, material objects are incapable of representing concepts and names. Every physical object in current science only describes itself rather than other objects. Similarly, physical objects only refer to themselves and not to other objects. If, therefore, physical objects are used to represent names and concepts, then such objects would be indistinguishable from things that describe themselves and only name themselves. It follows that the categorical distinction between things, names, and concepts cannot be maintained in current physical theories, and without the ability to maintain such a categorical distinction, any attempt to use objects to denote names and concepts will lead to logical contradictions. We can conclude that such physical theories and the objects they describe are either inconsistent or incomplete. If the theory attempts to incorporate names and concepts, then it will be inconsistent. If the theory avoids names and meanings, then it will be incomplete. Current physical theories avoid names and meanings and reduce everything to independent objects that only identify themselves and describe themselves. All such physical theories are incomplete because nature also has the ability to encode names and meanings. Let's now turn to the problem of quantum theory in physics. I will illustrate the quantum problem with the example of an ATM. Assume that you're drawing $100 from an ATM. When you draw this money, you don't know in advance the denominations of the currency you will get. You can get, for example, one $100 bill, one $50 bill, and five $10 bill. Or you may get 9 $10 bill and 2 $5 bills. You can only know that you will get a total $100, but you don't know the denominations. Now let's further assume that each of these currency notes have the same physical size and weight, so there is no way of distinguishing them physically. You need to be able to read the currency note to understand its value. And without that literacy, it's just a piece of paper. In the same way, if matter is symbols and meaning, then the physical properties become inadequate to decide the symbol's meaning. The measurement is unable to detect the symbolic meaning, but can only detect the number of times an object is received. It computes probabilities of the occurrence of an event rather than the total amount of meaning, e.g. the value of the cash being received. Quantum theory similarly tells us that when we measure an ensemble of particles, there are several ways in which we can divide the whole ensemble into parts, and each part represents the probability of a detector receiving a quantum particle. In our analogy, this corresponds to the probability of user receiving a certain number of currency notes without knowing their true denomination. In addition, when you get the money from the ATM, you cannot be certain if $50 notes will come before $10 notes and vice versa. The same amount of money can be delivered to you using the same denomination in many different orders. But this problem will follow only when we treat the events as currency denominations. The same total value can be delivered through the same parts, but in different orders. We cannot predict the order in advance. These two types of indeterminism in quantum theory can be resolved if we treat quantum objects as symbols of meaning. The indeterminism of denomination will now represent the choice of vocabulary, while the indeterminism of denomination order will represent the choice of a word sequence to form a sentence. The probability of current quantum theory will be partially irrelevant because they will correspond to how often certain denomination is obtained without knowing the denominational value. How frequently we get the currency notes is irrelevant to the value being delivered unless we know the denominations. We must treat the notes as not as pieces of paper, but as symbols of monetary value. Then we can decode the probabilities into an order which becomes an order of symbols. Like a proposition, it will encode a more complex meaning. While current quantum theory cannot predict the denominations, words, and their order, sentences, these can be predicted if reality is symbolic. The same meaning can be denoted using different words and order in the words, which helps explain that we are observing the same reality. The observation, however, pertains only to the expression of reality and not to reality itself. That is, reality exists as value rather than as currency notes which express this value. The same meaning can be expressed through different sentences which involve different words and word sequences. It is only through the recognition that meanings are logically prior to sentences can the quantum problem be satisfactorily solved. I think we'll have to continue. I say thank you very much for this time. Cheers, and have a lovely afternoon.